Thanks everybody for joining in tonight's webinar. I know that we're all stuck at home, and so we're excited to hear about something a little different other than washing our hands and staying away from everybody, or the current trend of what's going on in the world. So I'm really excited to share with you what we discussed at DAC Days. I know that a lot of folks weren't able to make it to DAC Days, which I would really highly recommend that you do try next year. But for those that weren't able to make it and those that did come, I wanted to recap because we just give you a lot of information. I'm going to recap some of the updates that we've done over the last year to the DAC products. So I wanted to start out, I started it out with a slide on the DAC oil. Now, any of you that are part of the DAC authorized dealer Facebook page, any dealers out there, you really need to get onto that Facebook page. It's a private group for authorized DAC dealers, and there is a bunch of cool information that we share there, and you can talk with each other about ideas. You know, now's the time that we need to stick together, and we really need to be sharing ideas. Today I've posted quite a lot about the DAC oil, so it seems fitting that I'm talking about it again. Prior to DAC Days, I had been confronted by a customer that the DAC oil had caused her horse to have an HYPP attack, and that she was convinced that there was potassium in the DAC oil because she had read on the internet that canola oil, which is the primary ingredient in the DAC oil, has potassium in it. Well, I could tell her till I was blue in the face that it did not cause her horse to have an HYPP attack. For those of you that aren't familiar with HYPP, these horses can't have potassium, high amounts of potassium in the diet. So what I did was I went ahead and we sent out a sample of the DAC oil to an independent testing lab to test for the components, and this is exactly what came back. There is no protein, there's no calcium, there's no phosphorus, there's no magnesium, there's absolutely no potassium, there's no zinc, copper, manganese, there are no carbohydrates, no sugars and starches. The vitamin E there actually, whoopsie, should say 4,000 IUs per pound. The omega-3, 6, 9s you can see there, and the calorie content. But there is no potassium. So as we go forward, there have been some changes to some of the DAC products that occurred after the last DAC Days. If you've been on any of these webinars, you've heard these before, but we recapped it at DAC Days because I wanted to talk about all the things that we had changed since the last, over the last year. So we included an ingredient called Calcite into two of our products, into the DAC Cold Grower and into the DAC Cool Gut. As we go on, we'll understand why it was important to put these ingredients in these products. It's a natural marine ingredient made from fossilized red algae. It's rich in minerals, and the product contains antacid properties, and it stabilizes the pH in the stomach. And that's primarily the calcium and magnesium that do that. When you look at it under a microscope, it has this honeycomb structure, and it's this honeycomb structure which increases the surface area exponentially. That is what gives this calcite the edge over traditional forms of calcium carbonate, for example. Calcium carbonate, if you look at it under a microscope, has a solid surface and it's not very porous, but if you look at calcite under a microscope, it looks like this, and you can see how many additional surface areas there are that can either buffer the stomach acid or enzymes then can attack so that we can absorb calcium for bone metabolism. A little hard to see here. It's easier to visualize it with the slide before the honeycomb, but you can see limestone or calcium carbonate. It has a pretty solid surface, but the calci powder is more rigid, more bumpy because it's got a lot more surface area. About 25% more efficient at buffering than calcium carbonate. So why is this important? You know, we are in the business of giving people solutions to their problems, but we need to make sure that we're clear on what the problems are. And one of the biggest problems in our performance horses today is gastric ulcers. About 90% of our horses have gastric ulcers, about 60% have them in the hindgut, and about half the population have them in both regions. The factors causing these ulcers: fasting, so long periods of time between meals, high grain diets, not feeding enough hay or pasture to the horses, stress. Now, of course, right now we're not transporting our horses. We are stabling them still. We're not doing intense exercise, but there is other stresses that are on our horses right now. Maybe their routine has changed because there's different people at the barn. You're not riding your horse because your facility is on lockdown and there are only limited a number of people allowed to go there. So stress comes at horses from many different angles. The other issue is the long-term use of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like Butte, which wear away at that mucus coating. If we give horses free choice access to grass hay over a 24-hour period, and we measure the acidity in the stomach, we see that for the majority of the time, the acidity sits above that yellow line, which is the gold standard of being healthy. So between a 4 and a 7 is where stomach acid should normally sit when horses are continually chewing and they're producing saliva and they're buffering that stomach acid with that hay. This hay wasn't anything special. It wasn't alfalfa. It wasn't any special kind of hay. This result here in the stomach with this acid is simply due to the horses continually chewing and continually swallowing hay. Now, if we take away the hay and the grain for a 24-hour period in those same group of horses, you can see that now we have a completely different picture in front of us. And for the majority of the time, the acid is between a 1 and a 2. And now that is severe acid that's going to burn your finger. It only took an hour for the acid to plummet, the acid pH to plummet down, the stomach pH to plummet down to between a 1 and a 2. Because it can be as quick as 30 minutes for food to pass through the stomach. By 18 hours, the horses had bleeding lesions. By 6 hours, these horses had reddening of the stomach lining, which is the precursor to gastric ulcers. And what is not uncommon, especially when the days are shorter, the daylight hours are shorter, is that we're feeding our horses by 5 to 7 p.m. at night, and we're not coming back until maybe 6, 7 o'clock in the morning. That's an 11 to 12-hour window where these horses have nothing to eat, and they're chewing on wood, they're chewing shavings, they're chewing bedding, anything that they can get to chew on to create that model like in the slide before, where they're chewing, so they're producing saliva and they've got something in their stomach buffering that stomach acid. So you can see how it's very, very easy to create this issue of gastric ulcers. So remember, we are in the business of providing people solutions, but people need to understand the problems so that we can best explain how our solution will work. So some research. We're always conducting research, and research done on this calcium source in New Zealand looked at gastric ulceration in adult horses, and over a 30-day period, these horses were supplemented. There were 10 horses ranging in ages and sex, and at the beginning of the trial, every horse had some varying degree of gastric ulceration, anywhere from a 1 to a 3, so minimal to severe. By the end of the trial, 100% of the horses had significantly reduced their ulcer score, and 70% of the horses had an ulcer score of 0 by day 30. It's interesting to note in this last column also that those that didn't have a score of 0, their score was only a 1. So they were significantly lessened in these horses. So that's looking at gastric buffer, that buffering that stomach acid. What does this highly bioavailable source of calcium do in regards to bone formation or bone turnover? So this was a research study done on yearlings at Michigan State. And they looked at osteocalcin. Now, osteocalcin is a marker that we use to measure bone formation. Okay? And so the blue bars are horses that were supplemented with limestone or calcium carbonate, and the orange bars are horses that were supplemented with this novel form of calcium. You can see across the board at every time point, the horses that were supplemented with this calcite had significantly elevated osteocalcin levels, so that is indicative of significantly elevated bone formation. What do we need to do in our young growing babies, whether they're going to grow up to be halter horses, they're going to be Western horses, dressage horses, jumping horses, Amish buggy horses, whatever they are going to be, we need them to be sound. And how do we create them to be sound? Number one, we start with a good skeleton. This study looked at this calcium source as well, but then they looked at it in young thoroughbreds that were exercising. So these thoroughbreds are still going through this growth phase. They still have all this bone constantly remodeling. And the blue bars represented the horses, the control horses not receiving the supplement, and the red bars, the horses were receiving the supplement. And at 30 and 90 days, these horses had significantly elevated bone density. And these two charts are just looking at different views of bone density. But in both views, the bone density was significantly higher than the horses that did not receive the supplement. Again, this is really critical. Why else is this critical in these exercising thoroughbreds? Because we know most of these thoroughbreds that go to the track and begin their career as a racehorse, there's so many stresses on them, and they're on other medications for ulcers because they've gone from a relatively easygoing life, and now they're living in a barn with many other horses. They're eating high carbohydrate diets, they're probably not eating a lot of hay. And so that just really stresses horses. So they're getting other ulcer medications. Those ulcer medications, these proton pump inhibitor drugs, they actually can block the uptake of calcium. And there's research done by this same group in Kentucky on that fact. So it's really, really important that we are supplying these young growing horses with sources of calcium that are extremely bioavailable, because not only do we have constant bone remodeling, some of these horses may also be receiving other products that are interfering with that calcium absorption. So we put it in the cool gut. This is the first ingredient we put in the cool gut, and it's in the cool gut now. And you can see in the first ingredient on the label there, the active ingredients says calcite. And that is the calcium source that we're using. Now, other companies that may be utilizing this ingredient may use calcium sourced from algae or fossilized algae. I mean, there's all kinds of names that people might use, but AAFCO, the American Association of Feed Control Officers, they only recognize the word calcite as the correct name. Calci powder or calci powder advanced. These are just the brand names of the product that we use. The colt grower is the other product that we put the calci powder in, because these young growing horses, it's extremely important to make sure that they're getting a great start in life and that they're building the foundation to these foals. So the next product that we discussed was a new product called the DAC Energy Paste. And, you know, the name might change. The idea is this would replace the race booster paste. This is got a lot more bells and whistles. It currently is a single serve 60-gram tube, but after DAC days, what we rolled this product out and talked to the consumers at DAC days, and we had some samples that we sent around, and the general consensus was that a 60-gram tube was a little too bulky in the hand, so we opted to bring it back down to a 35-gram tube. And by doing that, we took out the electrolytes because the majority of our people that are feeding and that want to use an energy paste because they've got a highly exercising horse, they're feeding the DAC electroaid as well, or at least they should be, and you should be recommending that they do. So if you're selling the DAC Energy Paste, I would absolutely say you need to be feeding an electrolyte as well, and that will make it even more effective. So what does this, and it's going to be a 35-gram tube. So what is it going to do? It's going to support energy production. It's going to enhance exercise tolerance. It's going to help support stamina and endurance, support normal muscle recovery, support oxygen utilization. Why do we care about oxygen utilization? The more efficiently that you utilize oxygen, the more your muscles can use oxygen, and the better our performance will be. So we're using branched chain amino acids, BCAAs. Any of you in the kind of athletic field yourselves know that branched chain amino acids are a hot topic right now in human nutrition. And what do? They're essential amino acids, which means that the body can't make them. They need to consume them in their food. So they're going to reduce fatigue in both sprint and endurance sports. This is research that has proven this. Increase in exercise efficiency due to heightened levels of endurance and sprint capacity. We've noted increased markers for physical conditioning, fitness, and endurance in human athletes that are supplementing with branched chain amino acids. Decreased muscle inflammation. Now that's huge because remember, exercise is constantly causing inflammation. Increased muscle recovery, reduced fatigue, and there's also benefits to branched chain amino acids when we're talking about liver health if we've got horses that have liver issues. Other essential amino acids, lysine and glycine. Lysine is an important building block for all proteins in the body, builds lean body mass and promotes normal growth. These can help with reduce anxiety and stress. So with an energy paste, we want to boost energy, but we need to make sure it's focused, controlled energy. So we don't want our horses being nervous, and that nervous energy, that cortisol being released without having some focus. Aids in the formation of maintenance of skin collagen, helps the body absorb calcium. So again, these thoroughbreds that are struggling because they're really stressed and they're on all kinds of medications need every aid that they can get in absorbing this calcium. Supports immune function, cardiovascular system, muscle repair, joints and nerves, and glycine inhibits muscular deterioration, and both of these also can help boost muscle recovery. Now we've removed the electrolytes because, as I said, these folks are going to be feeding an electrolyte supplement to these horses, or at least they should be. It gives you another product to sell to them. But what I did want to point out is that folks get a little nervous. Again, the HYPP horse. You can disregard the top line of the energy paste. I'll draw a line through it. But I thought this was a great opportunity just to talk about potassium and its incorporation in ingredients. So let's just say oats, for example. 4 pounds of oats. Well, oats have a potassium content of about 0.5%. So in 4 pounds of oats, you're going to get about 0.3 ounces of potassium. That's not really much at all. It's insignificant. Alfalfa. Alfalfa has a potassium content of 3%. And 4 pounds of alfalfa would give you 1.92 ounces of potassium. Now that is getting up to be significant. Electroaid powder, it's got 11% potassium. Well, most of you would say there's no way, I can't feed the electroaid paste powder to my horse with HYPP because it's got too much potassium in it. Well, based on the feeding rate, which is 3 ounces, you're going to get 0.8 3 ounces of actual potassium. So this comes back to our story of you got to understand a little bit of math and attach your percentages to a value to get the actual amount, or whether it be protein or carbohydrates or potassium in this case, that you're actually getting out of the product that you're feeding. Electroaid paste, same thing, 7.5% potassium. Anyone with a HYPP horse is going to say, I can't feed that to my horse. I want my ingredients to have 1.1% or less of potassium. Well, across the board, the DAC electroaid paste at 35 grams a day has 0.09 ounces of potassium. Nothing. Grass hay, depending on when it was cut, can have quite high, can be very low in potassium, and we would look at that on our diet and say, well, it's 0.8% potassium, so I can feed that to my horse. But look, you're getting 2.56 ounces of potassium out of grass hay. We showed some examples from some Michigan grass hay and some Indiana grass hay and some Western alfalfa, and you can see there the levels based on 20 pounds of each of those types of hays, how much potassium we're actually getting out of those ingredients. So when confronted with, I have a horse with HYPP and I know I need to keep potassium down, or I'm feeding a horse with metabolic syndrome, whatever, don't just disregard a product because at face value it doesn't seem like it might work. Do the math, contact me. Obviously, the DAC electroaid powder and the DAC electroaid paste are completely safe for this horse. Oh, I need to get my drawing tool off now. So what else does this product have in it? It has B vitamins. Some B vitamins are going to help with the metabolism of protein, fat, and carbohydrates, energy production, red blood cell formation, nerve function, makes new cells, DNA synthesis. That's really critical. That's the beginning of life. Choline is not a B vitamin, but it acts like one, stimulating energy production. And you say, well, I've heard her speak before, and she says B vitamins are made by the microbes in the hindgut of the horse. And yes, they are. But if your horse is already under a little stress, he may not be producing enough B vitamins. And we know that by adding extra B vitamins, we can also really support these different functions in the body. I know none of us are going to shows right now, and we probably have no need for the DAC Energy Paste yet, but we're getting those electrolytes out, we're getting it into a smaller tube, and as soon as competition starts up again, people are going to be going left, right, and center because they're so sick of being stuck at home. So let's move on. Again, setting the stage for another solution, another technology that we're utilizing in the feeds. The horse is a fiber-based animal. You know, they're designed to eat a wide variety of forages, nibbling constantly, eating for about 17 hours out of the day, moving while eating. They live in herds and they eat from the ground. That is normal for a horse. So you can see the picture on the left and the picture on the right are like black and white. They're completely different. Picture on the left, wild horse. Picture on the right, that's a domestic horse, a horse living in a very normal situation like our modern horses do. He eats a lot more cereal grain-based diet. He eats it fast. He's eating out of a bucket hanging at chest height. He does varying levels of exercise, and he has no socialization from his buddies. So there's all kinds of stress going on there. We know that pasture provides our horses with not only just fiber and nutritional health, but exercise, socialization, this foraging behavior that they exhibit. But pasture is not always available. A lot of our horses rely 100% on hay, and even this time of year, if you've got pasture right now is 80% water. So horses, these values here, the 1%, 2%, 3% of body weight, whatever it might be, that is of dry matter, dry forage. And hay is 95% dry anyway. So we just kind of We don't factor in that extra 5% moisture, and we say 10 pounds of hay equals the 10 pounds of dry matter that a horse would need as its absolute bare minimum. If you would do the calculations and factor in the 5% of moisture in hay, it would probably work out to be 10.25 pounds of hay, but that's a little crazy. So absolute bare minimum amount of body weight that a horse needs to eat just to keep the gut functioning is 1% of their body weight. So that's 10 pounds for a 1,000-pound horse. Now, he'll be nasty, he'll lose weight, he'll get behavioral issues and gut issues, but that will keep his gut moving. Horse on a diet, a weight loss program, 1.2% of their body weight would be 12 pounds of forage. Any of you have a fat horse know that when you start to restrict intake, then horses get cranky. And so the less you feed your horse, the more you have to manage them. It takes quite a lot of time to manage a fat horse. But typically we're going to be feeding between 1.5 to 2.5% of body weight. So usually when I balance rations for people, I'm working on that 2% of body weight as an average. So 20 pounds of forage. Horses eat off the ground. They can chew considerably more versus when they eat at chest height. 2 pounds of oats or hay on the ground in a tub, they're going to chew that 1,000, 2,000 times respectively, versus 2 pounds of oats at chest height, they're only going to chew that about 350 to 500 times. So we're significantly cutting down the saliva production. I've shown you before that horses are smart and sometimes we're not. This is what happens if you don't feed enough fiber to your horses. These bars, the gray bars, represent high fiber, low concentrate diet, so a low grain diet, high fiber diet. The white bars represent a high grain, low fiber diet. And if you go all the way to the end of the graph, you see that there's no difference. Those two bars are representing the total amount of time these horses spent eating during the observed time. And there's no difference. They spent the same amount of time chewing on something. If you come back to the beginning of the graph, though, now it starts to differentiate what was going on. The horses that you gave a lot of hay to, they spent more time chewing that hay. Makes sense. And the horses that got a lot of grain, they didn't spend as much time eating what you provided them because it was quick to eat. So what did the horses that didn't get a lot of hay eat for the rest of the time that they were observed, so that it looked like there was no difference in the total time chewing something? They were eating bedding and feces. So it just goes to show that horses are smart. Sometimes we don't always keep up, but when we don't provide them enough forage, we can really harm the hindgut of the horse. We're stressing them every angle. We're stressing them. Exercise, we ride them in the heat, we're transporting them. Injury, pain, psychological stress from separation. They're herd animals. They actually like to be with their buddies. And then feeding management, depending on where you're feeding, on the ground, on the wall, enough hay, not enough hay, types of ingredients that you're using. All of this can play into psychological stress. You've all been to the barn where the horses are pouring and pouring and pouring because they're anticipating feed time. That is stress. 90% of horses have gastric ulcers, as I mentioned before. Half the population have them in both regions. And 60% of them have them in the colon. If any of you have seen my diagrams of the digestive system, you know 65% of the horse's digestive system is made up of the hindgut. The hindgut made up of the cecum, large colon, and small colon. So these hindgut ulcers can be exponentially more detrimental to the horse. Intermittent colic-like symptoms. They lose a lot of weight. They can run a fever because there's all kinds of bacteria back here that can be affecting this tissue. If they've got diarrhea, which is a very common symptom of these hindgut issues, then they're going to have dehydration, because if the water's not being absorbed, then they're going to get dehydrated. Sometimes also there can be edema along the undercarriage of the horse. Now, unlike stomach ulcers where you can stick a camera down their throat, it's not as easy with hindgut ulcers. There are some blood parameters that your veterinarian might be able to look at. They might be able to ultrasound and look at the abdominal wall, but it is more difficult. One of the classic signs is this chronic diarrhea. Gastric ulcer and colonic ulcer symptoms, but just don't seem to be able to do anything to fix it. Dull coat, poor hooves, allergy symptoms. If you put them on some kind of one of these drugs, these proton pump inhibitor drugs are going to stop that acid in the stomach. It might improve a little bit and then immediately reverts when they're taken off. Strong erratic behavior. So not just a little grouchy, but strong erratic behavior, and then this chronic diarrhea. These are all symptoms of this hindgut distress. And so what happens in the hindgut is we have these cells lining the intestinal wall, and they're called mucosal cells. And there's little fingers on top of them, and those fingers increase the surface area. But between these cells are things called tight junctions. And tight junctions are just like gates, and they're supposed to open up and allow fully digested food particles through these gates into the bloodstream and off to be utilized. But what happens when we put stress on horses is stress through this hormonal cascade actually interferes with the strength of these tight junctions. And so these gates just are constantly open, and they're allowing all this undigested food particles and toxins to leak through the intestinal wall, causing all these symptoms that I showed on the previous slide. So you can see here, this is a close-up view of those nice tight junctions. Properly digested food particles are absorbed and everything else stays out. But this is when we have this issue of leaky gut, is what we call it in people, and that's what we're calling it in horses. These large food particles and bacterial debris leak through these broken down barriers into the bloodstream and wreak havoc. We know that heat, stress, exercise, putting horses in stalls, variation in forage, excess carbohydrates, mycotoxins, which come from mold spores. These can be damaging to the gut. Sometimes long-term doses of antibiotics, or as I mentioned, these chronic gastro GERD, ulcer GERD type things that are omeprazole-based products. These all can stress the gut. You can see everything we do with horses stresses them. And so we're incorporating a new technology, and this technology utilizes two different ingredients combined together. Zinc, it's an essential nutrient, plays a pivotal role in affecting the gut wall. So if you remember a few slides back and we were looking at those mucosal cells, and you see the little fingers that are on the end, zinc is absolutely critical for the structure of these mucosal cells. And zinc deficiency will cause inflammation and edema and breakdown of these mucosal cells and these tight junctions in between. Now, butyric acid, butyrate, it's created by bacteria in the hindgut. It's a short-chain fatty acid. We know that there's a particular bacteria called Lactospiraceae, and it creates butyric acid, butyrate, and we know that butyrate has a role in also protecting that mucosal lining, that gut lining. But with our stressed horses, we know that that particular bacteria declines, taking away the horse's natural ability to protect its own tissue. So we've taken this zinc and this butyric acid, encapsulated the zinc in the butyric acid, and we have this product called Butapearl ZEQ. And it's microencapsulated. It's like a little pearl zinc, and this particular version is for horses. Butyric acid supports those tight junctions. It also promotes microbial diversity. And we know that a vast array of microbes in the hindgut is most healthy. Zinc also supports those tight junctions, and it also supports those mucosal cells and the mucosal cell wall as well. Now, this product works in the hindgut, the cecum, the large colon, the small colon, the rectum. That's where this butyryl ZEQ works. The calcite works in the stomach of the horse, and the butyryl works in the hindgut of the horse. So as I mentioned, it's microencapsulated, and just like other ingredients we utilize, like the live cell yeast, microencapsulated because we need to get it through the upper part of the digestive system and get it to the hindgut where it can actually be utilized. The microencapsulation also helps with dust and reducing odor. So this leaky gut syndrome is more than just colic. I mean, to narrow it down to the primary issues that we have when we have this leaky gut issue and we've got all these toxins leaking through the intestinal lining, we see laminitis is a function, diarrhea, skin allergies, and we're looking at different nutrients in the diet that it might be causing, or different ingredients in the diet that might be causing it. But 9 times out of 10, your horse isn't allergic to alfalfa or soy or whatever. It could have hindgut issues, which are showing up as skin allergies or allergies in general, because what does the body do when there's all of this toxic material in the bloodstream? It brings all its white blood cells to the area, which causes inflammation because it's trying to get rid of it, and it looks like an allergy. Performance and behavior issues because the horse is in serious pain. So it's more than just colic symptoms. And so we've chosen to put this into the cool gut as well. We never make changes just for the sake of making changes. These two technologies, the calcite and the butyryl ZEQ, are backed by science. We've gone around and around and made sure that the science is there and that they're going to complement each other and that they're going to improve the cool gut, not detract from it. And so I think that this is, if you liked the cool gut before, you're going to love it now. You will notice on the label, so we've got calcite, you will see zinc, and you will see butyric acid listed in the active ingredients. We've also put this in the Rescue Aid paste. And the Rescue Aid paste, it's going to be listed in the ingredients as zinc oxide and butyric acid. The Rescue Aid paste will now also, it's primarily live cell yeast. It's got some moss in there, so it's got yeast sac and moss. And this is really, really going to be beneficial as a therapeutic quick dose for horses that may have diarrhea or be undergoing some kind of immediate gastrointestinal distress. So, in summary, the Butypearl decreases the effect of stress by supporting those tight junctions, promoting microbial diversity, and improving the lining of the gut. Finally, I know that we rolled out the pre-buff, and you've all heard me talk about the pre-buff. But, you know, we also need to make sure that every ingredient that we release to the public is working perfectly. And we jumped the gun a little with the pre-buff and didn't realize that the calcite inclusion in it, the calcite is just so darn effective that it was buffering stomach acid too high, and it was binding up. We also had magnesium in the product because we needed to make sure that it was we wanted to make sure it was, you know, buffering. But the calcite is just so effective that we were struggling with it. And so we reached out and we've done some independent research with the University of Kentucky that I'll show you. And we've now finalized the pre-buff with the label is done, the formula is finalized, the research is there, and it's being manufactured starting next week. Why? Again, that's the solution. What's the problem? We've talked about acidity when we talked about stomach ulcers before, and we've talked about the cool gut, which is kind of a long-term product that people are going to use when horses have ulcers. But we can change the acidity of the stomach very quickly just by stressing them. but it doesn't necessarily mean that every horse is going to have ulcers. So we wanted a product that was going to give instantaneous buffering and could be used as a one-off. And so you've got the little pH scale here, how we measure acidity, and you can see that a pH of 7 is what water is. Remember when I showed you the graph of the horses eating for 24 hours, how much, where the acidity in their stomach sat? When they were chewing on hay for 24 hours, producing saliva and diluting it with forage, the acid sat between a 4 and a 7. That was the ideal range for, that's the normal range for the stomach to sit. So what does a buffer do? A buffer solution is, it changes the pH and it holds the pH. Okay, so we wanted to take the acid. We know that the acid in the stomach is between a 1 and a 2. And we wanted to be able to put something into the horse's diet that was going to mimic that normal response of constant grazing. Because as much as I tell people I want you to be continually feeding your horses and making sure they've got hay in front of them all the time, I know that it's just not going to happen. And there are times when we need some instantaneous buffering. 2 parts of the stomach. You've got your protected region at the bottom, non-protected at the top. You can see a nice healthy stomach in the top photograph and a horse with stomach ulcers in the bottom photograph. Now, one thing that happens when you exercise a horse is there's pressure on the stomach, and it squeezes the stomach and it pushes that fluid up into that non-protected region. Happens with pregnancy as well. So we call it the splash effect when this acid is splashing up. So again, how about a product that you can feed immediately prior to exercise or immediately prior to whatever stressful event, so that we might be able to lessen the damage to the stomach lining and hopefully avoid horses getting gastric ulcers. We've talked about the things that are decreasing the pH, the transporting, exercise, all of that, but weaning is a source of stress that will decrease the pH of the stomach. Veterinarian visits, deworming, any kind of anxiety will all play a role in the pH of the horse's stomach. The Calcite powder has significantly more buffering capacity than limestone or sodium bicarbonate, which baking soda. You can see with this visual here, the buffering capacity of sodium bicarb on a soccer field kind of covers the goalpost, and the calcium carbonate or limestone, little circle in the middle, but because of the porous nature of the Calcite powder, it covers the whole soccer field. So it's very, very effective at buffering and very, very effective at mixing. And that was our blessing and a curse for us as we were creating this product. It's also got threonine in there. And what's threonine? It's an essential amino acid, again, one that horses can't make in their body. They have to get it in their diet. And threonine, the intestines utilize threonine more than any other essential amino acid. And the gut retains as much as 60% of the dietary threonine for synthesis of mucins. Mucins form a mucus layer coating the gut lining, forming a physical barrier to protect against irritants such as acid. Okay, so people ask me, well, what about papaya or aloe vera or any of these? The premise behind these products is they are that mucousy membrane, right? So you put it in the horse consumes it, and the idea is that it artificially puts this mucus coating on the horse's stomach lining. But unless your horse is continually eating those products or consuming them, the acid will just keep building up and wash it away and wash it away. We don't want to put a Band-Aid on. We don't want to artificially add something to the diet that's just going to put that mucus coating there. What we want to do is we want to help the horse help itself, right? You want to teach the guy to fish. You don't want to just give him a fish. So if we give the horse threonine in his diet, threonine is going to feed the horse making its own mucus layer. And then if it's making its own mucus layer, it's continually making that mucus layer, so it doesn't matter about the acid in its stomach. So that is why we added threonine. the three other products that kind of sit in the same category as buffers, the DAC pre-buff, it doesn't have calcium carbonate or limestone. Your gut health and your nutrient buffer product do. It doesn't utilize alfalfa as a source of calcium. Now, alfalfa is a nice ingredient, but there are better sources of calcium, and your Outlast uses primarily alfalfa. Now, the Outlast does also have calcite in it, but a lot of the calcium does come from alfalfa. We have threonine, which is boosting that mucus production. And we don't use sodium bicarb, which the gut health product does, because sodium bicarbonate, as you noted from the soccer diagram, isn't as effective as a buffer. And also, if you feed too much of it, it can be actually a banned substance. It's a liquid product. It's a 30 cc serving size now. We literally got the research back from the University of Kentucky the morning of DAC Day. So I had already created my slides, and their research showed us that 30 cc's, when we originally had planned on 60, 30 cc's was going to give us the most ideal gut buffering and sit right in that 4 to 7 window. So gastric acid sits down here between a 1 and a 2. Water, orange bar, has a pH of 7, that's neutral. The DAC pre-buff, its normal resting pH sits right there just above water. The nutrient buffer and the gut health product, they sit right above an 11. Now, that's not that good, because now we're getting up to the ammonia kind of bleach end of the spectrum, and you don't want to be neutralizing the stomach acid that much, because then, we're turning off the effects of the stomach acid, which the stomach acid is there for a reason, and we want to be able to utilize stomach acid, but do it in a manner in which the horse naturally would. And that is, you want to take the stomach acid and you want to make it between 4 and a 7. You want to take that really strong acidic acid that's in the horse's stomach naturally, and you want to make it sit between a pH of a 4 and a 7, because that is exactly where it would sit if the horse was grazing. Remember? Sits between a 4 and a 7. That is where it's naturally sits when horses are constantly grazing, and that's what we want to do. We want to recreate grazing behavior. So on a chart here, this is the University of Kentucky research looking at time point -5. That's where they measured the acid, and it sat at a 2, and then they added the DAC buffer here, and it took it immediately to a 4.6, and then it slowly rose to right around a 7 just after about nearly close to an hour and a half. The nutrient buffer, the yellow product, it immediately took it to a 10, up to an 11, and now nearly to 12. And what is 12? 12 is ammonia. And we're getting all the way down here to drain cleaner being really alkali solution, and that is not good to have in the horse's stomach, because now we're outside of that normal range for where that stomach acid would sit. You've heard me talk before about alfalfa, and there's research to show that alfalfa is a good gut buffer. If we look at alfalfa, if I draw where alfalfa sits on this curve, alfalfa starts here, so we start here at a 2, goes up to about a 4.1, and then it really just sits. It's really hard to draw with a mouse, but it sits right there at about a 4.1, and it doesn't go any higher than that. So it's still above a 4, which is ideal, but it's just not sitting at as much into that natural range of where the horse's gut acid would sit. This is that DAC buffer, the pre-buff by itself, sitting on a chart, just so that we can see exactly where it goes. We don't want to use sodium bicarb. It's not as effective as a buffer as the pre-buff, the calcite. It breaks down quickly, and that sodium bicarb is then absorbed into the plasma, into the bloodstream of the horse. And the maximum threshold of sodium bicarb in plasma has been set by several regulatory authorities, so these thoroughbred racing authorities, and over this certain threshold can lead to positive testing. So we chose not to use sodium bicarb. Number one, because we've got a better alternative, but number two, can get some positive drug tests if fed incorrectly. You've all seen this flyer for the pre-buff. If a horse is stressed, weaning, training, trailering, deworming, vet visits, high performance, there's so many stresses on horses, that's going to alter the gut pH. This works as a pre-workout buffer or a pre-stressful event buffer. When to use it? Pre-workout, pre-stressful event. It's got the calcite in it. It's got the threonine that's going to help with mucus production. But it doesn't have the other ingredients that Cool Gut has in it that are going to help with tissue health. It's a preemptive. The Cool Gut helps with stomach and hindgut distress. Pre-buff is really just going to work in the stomach. And the Cool Gut has the glutamine in it, which helps with the stomach, the gut lining, and the yeast, which is going to buffer that hindgut tissue, more chronic issues. So I appreciate you all joining our webinar this evening, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.